I was born where the river bends and the wind carries the songs of my ancestors. The land was my first mother, and her voice moved through the grass and the water and the soft dust that rose under my feet. I remember running as a child beside the Missouri and hearing the old ones speak of the sacred flow that never ends. They said the river is alive and listens, and when you listen back it tells you who you are. I did not understand then how deeply those words would root inside me. I only knew the smell of sage and the warmth of my grandmother's hand as she whispered stories of the people who walked before us. She said every hill and stone holds a memory, and if we forget them, the world will fall silent. So I learned to listen to the quiet. In the mornings, I would watch the sun rise over Standing Rock and feel its light open the day like a prayer. Each beam touching the water, each shadow sliding away. I felt safe in that rhythm. The way the seasons folded into each other. The way life and death were only different verses in the same song. When I was young, I left for school far from the land. They told me the world was bigger than the reservation. They told me to chase success to fit into the city's pattern. But in the noise and glass and endless movement, I felt hollow. The air there did not carry the smell of home. I dreamed of the river every night. Years passed, and I returned to Standing Rock as a woman with lines on my face and stories in my bones. I began to work with my community, helping preserve our history, our voices, our names. So many of our elders had gone silent, and I could hear the emptiness growing between generations. I wanted to bridge that space to remind our children that they are born from courage. One evening, I stood by the water as the sky burned orange. The wind touched my cheek the way my grandmother once did, and I felt the land breathing under my feet. That was when I understood the word protector. It was not a title, it was a calling. Years later, they came with maps and machines and promises of progress. They said they would build a pipeline. They said it would be safe. They said it would bring prosperity. But when I looked at those lines drawn across our sacred ground, I saw a wound waiting to open. I remembered the stories of how our ancestors signed treaties that were broken. I remembered the prayers of mothers for their children's future. And I knew I could not stay silent. The river that raised me, the land that fed me, were being threatened again. And silence would be another betrayal. I walked to the hill above my home and watched the horizon where they planned to dig. I could almost hear the machines even before they arrived. And I felt a heaviness settle in my chest. For a moment, fear tried to take root. But then I heard my grandmother's voice. She said the land needs you to speak. So I opened my heart to the wind and promised I would not let them forget that this place is alive. The first camp was small, just a few tents beside the river. I called it Sacred Stone because the stones there carried our stories. People came quietly at first. Young ones, old ones, families bringing food and blankets and songs. They came because they felt the same ache, the same duty. At night the fire crackled and sparks lifted into the dark sky like tiny spirits returning to the stars. We told stories. We prayed. We laughed. We planned. The sound of drums traveled through the valley. And for the first time in many years, the land felt whole again. News spread beyond our hills. Cars began to arrive from other states. Then buses. Then caravans. Each day new faces appeared. Faces painted with hope and fear and determination. They came from every direction. Some had never met a native person before, but they came because they understood that water is life. I would stand before them and speak not as a leader, but as a mother, as a daughter, as someone who had listened to the river since birth. I told them we are all connected by the same veins of water that run beneath the ground. I told them that protecting the earth is not an act of rebellion, it is an act of love. And when I looked into their eyes, I saw that they felt it too. The camp grew like a living organism. Tents became villages. Villages became a movement. Voices rose together. Songs in many languages braided into one sound. The sound of life defending life. But with growth came tension. The government watched us. Companies sent guards. Helicopters hovered above the river. Winter crept closer. And fear whispered again. Yet each morning I walked to the water and dipped my hands into the cold stream. And I said the same words my grandmother once said to me. Thank you for another day. Give me strength to stand without hate. The snow began to fall. The wind cut through every layer of cloth. Still we stayed, because leaving meant surrender. And the river did not know the word surrender. One night, I looked out across the frozen plain. Fires glowing in the distance. Voices singing low songs to keep warm. I felt tears sting my face not from cold, but from the weight of what we were doing. I whispered to the night that, even if the camp fell, the spirit would not. The night I whispered to the frozen air, I felt something shift inside me. The river was sleeping under ice, yet its heartbeat pulsed through the ground beneath my feet. I realized that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to stand while shaking. The people around me felt it too, and that shared trembling became strength. Each morning smoke rose from the sacred fire and spread through the valley like a prayer too wide for words. We woke to the sound of drums echoing off the hills and the soft murmur of voices greeting the dawn. Our breath joined the mist rising from the river, and we felt alive even in the bitter cold. This was not just protest, this was remembrance. We built kitchens from salvaged wood. We built schools where children learned their language again. Artists painted signs that carried the rhythm of hope. Elders told stories beside the fire, and their words were medicine. For a moment in that valley, the world remembered how to live in balance. Then came the day when the machines moved closer, their metal teeth grinding against the earth like hunger. We gathered at the ridge and watched them approach. The sound was heavy and relentless, and yet under it we sang. We sang to remind ourselves that no machine can drown the heartbeat of the land. I remember the first time I saw lines of officers standing in armor against unarmed people. Their faces hidden, their eyes unreadable. Behind them, the machines waited. And in front of them stood grandmothers with sage bundles and children holding signs that said, "Water is life." I felt the air tremble. I wanted to reach out to those men to tell them they were standing on their own mother's skin. When the confrontation came, it was not with shouting, it was with prayer. I walked forward with my hands open. I told them, "We are not your enemy. We are the keepers of the same breath that fills your lungs." Some turned their eyes away, others looked at me with a flicker of doubt as if they had forgotten what they were defending. For a brief heartbeat, I thought maybe they would lower their weapons. But then the sound came. The rush of water cannons, the sting of gas. Voices crying in the cold night. And still we stood. That night I sat beside the fire, soaked and trembling. Around me people tended to the injured. Someone sang a healing song low and steady. I closed my eyes and saw my grandmother again. She said, "The land has seen darker nights than this. You must be the light that refuses to die." Days blurred together. Journalists came and left. Politicians made promises. The snow deepened, but the camp endured. We were no longer a protest, we were a memory in motion. Each step, each breath recorded by the wind itself. I remember one morning when a flock of geese passed overhead. Their wings glimmered against the pale sun. For a moment, every voice in the camp went quiet. We watched them fly in perfect formation. And I thought, this is what unity feels like. Each one holding the space for the other, each one trusting the path through the storm. When the order finally came to clear the camp, I walked the ground slowly. Each footprint told a story. Laughter, fear, love. The smell of smoke hung in the air like a final blessing. Some cried, some sang, some stood silent facing the water. I knelt and pressed my palm to the frozen soil and whispered, "Thank you for carrying us this far." As the buses took people away, I stayed behind until the last fire went out. The wind moved through the empty tents whispering names. I felt no defeat, only a strange quiet knowing that this was not the end. Movements are like rivers, they disappear into the ground and rise again somewhere else stronger and clearer. After the camp, I spent many nights alone. The world had returned to its noise. Some called us dreamers, some called us radicals. But I knew we had done something sacred. We had reminded humanity of its pulse. I often stood by the river and spoke to it as if it were my oldest friend. I told it about the people who came, the prayers we shared, the songs that lifted into the stars. I told it I was tired but not broken. And the water answered in its own language, a soft, endless murmur saying, "I am still here, and so are you." There were days when I questioned whether it mattered. Whether the pipeline could ever be stopped. Whether the world could truly hear us. But then letters began arriving from children, from strangers, from distant lands. They wrote that our story had awakened something inside them. They wrote that they had planted trees, that they had learned to respect the water. And I realized the river had carried our message far beyond what eyes could see. I grew older. My body weakened. But the land kept me upright. Each dawn I would walk to the hill and watch the sun rise through the mist. And I felt my ancestors walking beside me. They said we do not measure victory by what is built or destroyed. We measure it by the hearts that open. Now when I close my eyes, I can still hear the camp. I can still smell the smoke and the sweet grass. I can still see the faces illuminated by firelight. And I know that what we created was more than resistance. It was remembrance. It was love made visible. The river keeps flowing. The sky keeps turning. And somewhere a young woman stands on the bank listening to the same wind that once carried my promise. She will hear the call and she will answer as I once did. Because the land never forgets its protectors. The night came heavy and cold, and I felt the pulse of the land move beneath my feet like a hidden heartbeat calling my name. I stood by the fire, watching the sparks rise into the dark sky, each one carrying a prayer too small for words, yet too powerful to dye the air with sharp pen. Stars unblinking, and I whispered to the river that slept beneath the ice, and in that whisper I promised I would not leave. We built our lives from the frozen ground, tents rising like small hopes against the wind, smoke curling from the sacred fire like the breath of our ancestors. Each morning we gathered with faces half lit by dawn and half by memory. The drums began slow like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant, then grew louder, stronger, until every chest in the camp thudded in rhythm. We were many, but we were one. We were afraid, but we stood anyway, and that standing became our strength. Children ran between the tents, their laughter brighter than the cold. Women stirred great pots of soup, men hauled wood through the snow, and elders sat near the fire teaching the old words that carried the weight of generations. We learned again how to listen to the land through what the wind said when it moved through the grass. We remembered that we were guests here, keepers, not owners, guardians, not conquerors. Then one morning we saw them, the machines lined on the horizon, their metal bellies gleaming in the pale light. They moved like something alive, their teeth grinding against the earth. And I felt the river cry deep beneath the frozen surface. I felt it shudder, as if the world itself was wincing in pain. The air filled with a strange hum, part machine, part warning. And we gathered at the ridge facing them, our hearts pounding, but our hands open. I remember the silence before it began. It was thick like breath held too long. Then came the sound, the roar of engines, the crackle of radios, and over it all our voices rose, not in anger, but in prayer. The song carried through the air, bending around the machines, seeping into the metal. And I thought maybe even they could feel it, that old truth that no human power can own the earth. The officers came next, rows of them armored and faceless, their eyes hidden behind glass, their bodies moving as one behind them. The machines waited, their exhaust curling into the sky. Before them stood elders wrapped in blankets, holding sage bundles, and young ones clutching signs that said water is life. I wanted to step forward and tell them, you are standing on your mother's body, you are guarding your own heartbeat, but my voice caught and the air answered for me. When the clash came, it was not sudden, it was slow, like a storm building on the edge of the world. The first push, the first spray of water, the first scream. I felt it in my bones, the shock of cold, the sting of gas, the sound of people crying out, but not running away, because we had nowhere to run except deeper into the truth of why we were there. I closed my eyes and saw my grandmother again. She was calm. She said, "This is what standing looks like. It is not easy, it is not quiet, it is not safe." That night I sat by the dying fire, the ground soaked and hard beneath me. Someone was singing a soft song that wove through the smoke, a song of healing and endurance. I watched the embers fade and thought maybe this is what the ancestors meant when they spoke of courage, not a roar, but a whisper that refuses to disappear. The days bled together after that. Snow piled against the tents and wind howled like an old spirit remembering loss. But the camp endured, each person carrying a piece of light and passing it to the next. The journalists came and left, the officials spoke and vanished, but we stayed because leaving would have meant forgetting, and forgetting would have meant dying. I remember one morning when the sky broke open with color and a flock of geese passed overhead, their wings slicing the dawn. Every voice fell silent. We watched them move together, a single shape made of many hearts, and I thought this is what unity feels like, not perfection, not power, but trust, each one holding the path for the one beside them. When the order came to clear the camp, I walked slowly through the snow. Every footprint told a story, every tent a memory of laughter, of prayer, of sleepless nights. I touched the ground and whispered, "Thank you for carrying us this far." People cried, people sang, some knelt, others stood, staring at the river that had been both witness and guide. I felt the land breathing beneath the ice, saying, "I remember you." When the fires finally died and the wind swept through the empty valley, I stayed behind until the last ember faded. The silence was heavy, but not cruel. It felt like a pause, like the world taking a breath before beginning again. I knew then that this was not the end, because movements are rivers. They do not end, they only disappear into the soil, to rise again, somewhere else, clearer, stronger, alive. Afterward, I spent nights alone. The world had moved on, but I had not. I sat by the water and spoke to it as I would to a friend. I told it about the people who came, about the prayers that filled the air like unseen smoke, about the songs that rose like wings. I told it that I was tired, but not broken, and the river answered in ripples that said, I am still here, and so are you. There were moments when I doubted, when I wondered if anything had changed, if the world could ever listen. But then letters began to arrive from children, from strangers, from people far away. They wrote that they had seen us, that they had heard the song, that they had begun to plant trees, to learn the names of their rivers, to remember that water is not a resource, but a relative. And I knew then the message had traveled farther than any pipeline ever could. I grew older and my body carried the weight of years, but the land held me steady. I walked to the hill each dawn and watched the sun rise through the mist and felt my ancestors beside me. They whispered that victory is not measured in headlines or in buildings, but in hearts that open again to the earth. Now when I close my eyes, I can still see the camp, the glow of firelight on faces wet with snow, the sound of drums echoing against the hills, the smell of sage and smoke mixing with the cold air. And I know what we created was more than resistance, it was love made visible. It was memory turned into movement. It was the spirit of a people remembering who they were. The river keeps flowing, the wind keeps carrying our songs, and somewhere a young woman stands by the water listening to the same heartbeat that once called me. She will hear it, and she will answer, and when she does, the land will know her name, because the earth never forgets its protectors. When the seasons turned again, I could feel the land breathing beneath my feet, softer now like the sigh of an old friend. I walked along the riverbank where the grass had grown wild and tall, the water shimmered beneath the light of the morning sun, carrying whispers from faraway places, voices I once knew, laughter that belonged to those who stood beside me in the cold. I knelt down and touched the surface, feeling the pulse of the current moving strong and sure, and I thought how even after fire and frost the river always finds its way home. Each day I rose before the light and listened. The earth spoke not in words, but in rhythms, in quiet movements, in the sound of wings lifting through the fog. I could still hear the drums from long ago echoing faintly across the valley, not as noise, but as memory, a reminder that what we began never ended. It simply changed shape, flowing like water into every heart that dared to care. There were times I would see new faces standing by the water, young ones with steady eyes and open hands. They did not know me, but they carried the same fire that once lived in our camp. I watched them plant trees, I saw them kneel to pray, I heard them sing to the earth, as if they had always known how, and I smiled, because that was the promise we made, that the story would continue long after my voice grew quiet. The nights were long but gentle. I would sit by the window, watching the stars move across the black sky, each one a spark of a life once lived, a dream still unfolding, and I would whisper to them to carry our message to the ones still searching, to those who had forgotten how to listen, to remind them that the earth is alive and it remembers everything. Sometimes the wind would come fierce and sudden, whipping through the grass, bending the trees, and I would close my eyes and let it pass through me, feeling every gust like a heartbeat. It carried the scent of sage and rain, the same air that once wrapped around our tents and filled our lungs with courage. I would breathe it in and feel my spirit lift, as if the world itself was telling me it was not over, not yet. I remember the morning when I knew it was time to rest. The sky was pale blue and the horizon stretched endlessly, the same way it had when I was a child. I felt no fear, only a vast calm that spread through me like light. I walked to the river one last time. The air was cool and sweet. I could hear the soft rush of water against the stones. I sat on the bank and spoke to it, not with words, but with love. I told it thank you for carrying us, for holding our reflections, for reminding us who we are. As I sat there, I could see the faces of all who came before me, my mother, my grandmother, the women who taught me how to stand when standing meant breaking. They smiled without speaking, and I felt their hands on my shoulders, strong and warm, guiding me forward. The wind rose again, and I could hear songs rising from the other side, songs of welcome, songs of peace, songs that felt like home. The light grew brighter, the air warmer, and I felt myself becoming lighter, not fading, but expanding like mist rising from the river. I could feel every root, every blade of grass, every drop of water, and I understood that I was not leaving, I was returning. I was becoming part of everything I had ever loved. Now I live in the rustle of the cottonwoods, in the ripple of the water, in the cry of the geese. As they cross the sky, I am the echo in the wind that tells the children to listen. I am the spark in the fire that reminds them to hope. I am the quiet voice in their hearts that says, do not be afraid, for you are never alone. The river still flows, carrying our prayers. The land still breathes beneath the stars, and every time someone stands for what is right, I am there not as a ghost, but as a memory, alive as breath, as light as movement. So when you walk by the water and feel the wind touch your face, know that it is me saying, keep going, hold the earth close, speak gently to it, and it will answer with kindness. Remember that courage does not roar, it whispers, it endures, it loves. And when you look out over the hills and see the sun sink low behind the horizon, remember that the story is still being written, not in words, but in actions and hearts that refuse to give up, in hands that choose to heal. I am still here in the water, in the wind, in the fire, and in the silence. And as long as the river runs, the earth will remember my name, and through that memory, you will remember your own. The dawn comes soft and golden, and I rise again, not in body, but in light, drifting through the mist that gathers over the river. The world feels new yet ancient, the same song still humming beneath the soil. I move with it, unseen yet everywhere, within the whisper of leaves, the shimmer of water, the slow turning of the sky. I feel the heartbeat of the earth, and it is steady and strong. I watch the people who come now. They walk slower, they pause to listen, their hands touch the ground with care, and I know they have heard us, the ones who stood, the ones who prayed, the ones who believed that love was stronger than fear. They carry our songs in their breath, our stories in their steps. I see them teaching their children to speak to the river, to greet the morning with gratitude, and I know that the circle is whole again. The land heals itself in small, quiet ways, grass pushing through scarred soil, birds returning to build their nests near the water, life reclaiming what was once broken. And I whisper to the wind that this is the victory we dreamed of, not a banner, not a monument, but the steady return of balance, of kindness, of memory made real. When night falls, I watch the stars drift like embers across the dark sky, each one a reminder of a life that mattered, of a voice that rose when silence was easier. They shine not to be seen, but to guide, to remind us that every act of courage sends light into places we cannot see. I no longer need words, I speak through the rhythm of rain, through the warmth of the sun on skin, through the pulse of the river that never stops moving. I am there in every drop that touches the ground, in every breath drawn by those who still believe, and I know that belief will never die. To those who come after, I say this, listen, the world is alive, it speaks to you in ways beyond language. It asks only that you care, that you remember, that you stand when the time calls you to stand. Do not fear the weight of that calling, for it will make you whole. It will remind you that you are made of the same earth you fight to protect. When you stand by the water, close your eyes and feel the current against your skin. That is my hand, that is my heart, that is the promise we made, that love would never leave. The river still carries it, the wind still sings it, the fire still glows with it, and as long as you breathe, you are part of it too. And so I rest, not in silence, but in song and motion, in the eternal flow of life. I am the voice that rises with the dawn, the light that dances on the river, the spirit that walks beside you, unseen yet ever present, reminding you that you are strong, you are sacred, and you belong to this earth forever.